Ernest Nagel, Defending Atheism, Video 2. In this video, we're going to cover the rest of Part 3, which includes the ontological argument. Video 1 covers Part 1 and 2 of Defending Atheism, and the first two paragraphs of Part 3, which includes the cosmological or the first cause argument. Video 3 will cover Part 4, which covers the teleological argument or the argument from design. And Video 4 will cover the last two paragraphs of Part 5, which is the argument from religious experience. And Video 5 will cover Part 7, Negative's positive doctrine of atheism. To begin Part 3. The second proof of God's existence is usually called the ontological argument. It too has a long history going back to early Christian days, though it acquired great prominence only in medieval times. The argument can be stated in several ways, one of which is the following. Since God is conceived to be omnipotent, he's a perfect being. A perfect being is defined as one whose essence or nature lacks no attributes or properties whatsoever, one whose nature is complete in every respect. But it's evident that we have an idea of a perfect being, for we have just defined the idea. And since this is so, the argument continues, God, who is the perfect being, must exist. Why must he? Because his existence follows from his defined nature. For if God lacked the attribute of existence, he'd be lacking at least one attribute, and would therefore not be perfect. To sum it up, since we have an idea of God as a perfect being, God must exist. Now, let's look a little bit more closely at this passage and watch a different version than we're used to of the ontological argument appear. We'll start at the beginning, of course. Since God is conceived to be omnipotent, he's a perfect being. A perfect being is defined as one whose essence or nature lacks no attributes or properties whatsoever, one whose nature is complete in every respect. We can turn this into a premise that looks like this. God is a being whose nature lacks no attributes or properties, and whose nature is complete in every respect. Another way we can put this is to say that God is all perfect. All right, moving on. But it's evident that we have an idea of a perfect being, for we have just defined that idea. Now, we might recognize this from our earlier ontological argument. We can frame these two premises like this. If we can define something, then we have an idea of this thing. So, we have an idea of God as a being whose nature lacks no attributes or properties, and whose nature is complete in every respect. Right? So we have an idea of God as all perfect. Okay, moving on. Since this is so, the argument continues, God, who's the perfect being, must exist. Why must he? Because his existence follows from his defined nature. For if God lacked the attribute of existence, he'd be lacking at least one attribute, and then would therefore not be perfect. So this, of course, leads to everybody's favorite premise in the ontological argument, the fourth premise. But if God really is a being whose nature lacks no attributes or properties, and whose nature is complete in every respect, then God must exist. Because if God didn't exist, then he'd be missing an attribute, namely the attribute of existence, and following from this, he'd not be all perfect, because his nature would be missing an attribute. And of course, we end at the conclusion, since we have an idea of God as a perfect being, God must exist. And of course, the conclusion, so God exists. All right, now, I've also turned Nagel's ontological argument into a much shorter version that sort of takes out the awkward language. So we might start this argument off with the first premise, God is all perfect. If we can define something, then this thing is in our understanding, right? Calling back to Anselm's ontological argument. So an all-perfect God is in our understanding. But if God really is all perfect, then God must exist. Because if God didn't exist, then he wouldn't be all perfect, because he would be missing the attribute of existence. So God exists. Now, You might be wondering what all this all perfect and attributes of existence stuff means. Well, let's consider what attributes are. So, an attribute of the circle is that it's yellow, right? An attribute of the blue square is that it's a square. Another attribute not listed there is that it's blue. All right? Two attributes of the circle here are that it's big and green. An attribute of this line is that it's long, right? So attributes are characteristics that we can ascribe to things. Now, let's consider a couple of God-specific attributes. Maybe being all-knowing, which also is expressed as being omniscient. All right, that's definitely a God-style attribute. What about being all-powerful, which is being omnipotent? This is also an excellent example of a God-style attribute. All right, now one more. Existence. The attribute of existence, which means having existence. Okay. So, to be all perfect means that you have to have every attribute, right? So we see that God has all of the attributes, right? If there's an attribute, being all perfect means you have to have that attribute. God is all perfect, so God has all of the attributes. If a being really is all perfect, then it has to exist, because to be all perfect means that this being has every attribute, and existence is an attribute, so an all perfect being has to have it. All right, so that's how the argument goes in any case. Now let's consider Nagel's objection. Though the word existence may occur as the grammatical predicate in a sentence, no attribute is being predicated of a thing when we say that the thing exists or has an existence. All right, so that's a little bit confusing. But what we're trying to say here is that although in English, when I say something like, this apple is green, and this apple exists, in both cases, it seems like I'm attributing an attribute to the apple, right? In the second case, existence. But this is not an attribute in the same way that green is. At least so the objection goes. So, when we say that a lion has a tawny color, we're predicating a certain attribute of the animal, namely its color. And similarly, when we say that the lion is fierce or hungry. But when we say that the lion exists, all that we are saying is that something is or has the nature of a lion. We're not specifying an attribute which belongs to the nature of anything that is a lion. In short, the word existence does not signify any attribute, and in consequence, no attribute that belongs to the nature of anything. So, accordingly, it doesn't follow from the assumption that we have an idea of a perfect being that such a being exists. For the idea of a perfect being does not involve the attribute of existence as a constituent of that idea, since there's no such attribute. All right? So, how does this objection interact with Nagel's ontological argument? I included the short version here because it's easier for us to process. Well, this objection is attacking the fourth premise, right? Because it's saying, look, existence isn't an attribute. So we can't use the fact that a perfect being has to have existence to claim that that being exists. So remember that to be all perfect was supposed to mean that you had every attribute, right? But if existence isn't an attribute, then the argument falls apart. And we end up at Nagel's conclusion. The ontological argument, thus, has a serious leak, and it can hold no water.